Chapter 8. The Flood That Won't Go Away. It begins with Eurasia. Dr. Michael Brennan had spent 15 years studying comparative flood mythologies, and the pattern never failed to disturb him. Across every continent, in cultures that had never contacted each other, the same narrative emerged with mechanical consistency. Humanity reaches a certain level of development, becomes troublesome to the gods, and is wiped clean by water. One righteous survivor receives divine warning, builds a vessel, preserves life, and starts over in a simplified world. Not similar stories, identical structures. Sitting in his office at Harvard's Department of Folklore and Mythology, surrounded by translations from Mesopotamia, India, China, Mesoamerica, and North America, Brennan faced a question that academic archaeology preferred not to ask. How do isolated civilizations develop identical memories of global catastrophe? The conventional explanation was psychological universalism. Flood stories emerged independently because flooding was a common natural disaster that early societies needed to explain through mythology. But Brennan's analysis revealed something more troubling. These weren't explanatory myths about local flooding. They were preservation myths about a civilizational reset. And they all pointed backward to something that had been lost. The oldest version came from Sumer, pressed into clay tablets at least 4,000 years ago. The Eridu described a time when humanity had grown too numerous and too noisy for the gods to tolerate. So, the divine council decided on Eurasia, a flood that would wash the world clean and allow for a fresh beginning. But the god Enki disagreed with this decision. He secretly warned a man named Ziusudra, providing detailed instructions for building a vessel that could preserve life through the coming catastrophe. Ziusudra followed these instructions precisely, loading his boat with animals and supplies before the waters came. After 7 days, the flood receded. Ziusudra opened a window, sent out birds to test for dry land, and made offerings to the gods who had both destroyed and preserved the world. In return, he was granted immortality, not as a reward, but as insurance that someone would remember what had happened. The details were disturbingly specific. Not the vague metaphors you'd expect from ancient mythology, but practical information about disaster preparation and survival, as if the story was designed to function as instruction rather than inspiration. And it had worked. The same narrative structure appeared in every subsequent flood tradition, from the Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical account of Noah, each one preserving the essential elements: divine warning, righteous survivor, detailed instructions, catastrophic flood, mountain landing, bird reconnaissance, sacrificial offering, covenant renewal. Like backup copies of the same critical file, distributed across cultures to ensure the information couldn't be lost again. Brennan opened his analysis of flood mythology distribution patterns, maps showing how the same story had appeared in civilizations separated by oceans and millennia. The Vedic tradition of Manu and the Great Deluge. Chinese legends of Yu the Great and the Cosmic Flood. Hopi stories of the world's destruction and renewal. Incan accounts of Viracocha and the cleansing waters. Each tradition claimed the story as their own origin myth, but the structural similarities suggested they were all remembering the same event, or the same trauma. Because the flood myths weren't just about water, they were about memory itself. In every version, the flood represented a break in continuity. The world before the flood was different. More advanced, more populated, more connected to divine knowledge. The world after was simpler, smaller, starting over with fragments of what had been lost. It was like reading multiple accounts of the same computer crash, each one describing the moment when everything had to be rebuilt from incomplete backups. The archaeological evidence supported this interpretation in unsettling ways. Throughout Mesopotamia, excavations revealed flood layers dating to approximately 2,900 BCE, thick deposits of riverine silt, marking the violent end of early urban settlements at Shuruppak, Kish, and other Sumerian sites. These geological flood markers corresponded exactly to cultural disruption layers where sophisticated early civilizations suddenly disappeared and were replaced by simpler societies. But the flooding hadn't been global. It had been localized to the Fertile Crescent, where the world's first complex civilizations were developing. Which meant the flood myths weren't describing a planetary catastrophe. They were preserving the memory of a cultural catastrophe that had felt like the end of the world to the people who experienced it. The question was, what had been lost in those waters? Brennan found himself thinking about the peculiar characteristics of post-flood civilizations. The Sumerians who rebuilt after the Great Flooding demonstrated knowledge and capabilities that seemed to exceed what should have been possible for survivors of catastrophic social collapse. Their mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and organizational systems showed sophistication that suggested continuity with advanced knowledge, rather than gradual redevelopment from primitive conditions, as if they were reconstructing something they remembered imperfectly, rather than inventing something new. The flood myths themselves contained clues about what had been preserved. In every version, the survivor wasn't chosen randomly. He was selected because he possessed specific knowledge or qualities that the gods wanted to maintain through the transition. Ziusudra was described as wise and righteous. Noah was called perfect in his generation. Manu was portrayed as a keeper of cosmic law. These weren't just moral exemplars. They were living libraries chosen to carry forward essential information that couldn't be allowed to disappear completely. And what they preserved wasn't just biological diversity. According to the myths, they carried forward those packets of civilizational knowledge that enabled the reconstruction of organized society after the waters receded. But reconstruction from what template? And why was the template apparently more sophisticated than what most post-flood civilizations managed to achieve? In the growing silence of his office, Brennan found himself confronting a possibility that challenged everything archaeology assumed about human development. What if the flood myths preserved the memory of an actual civilizational collapse so complete that it had reset human society to a pre-urban state, forcing survivors to rebuild from fragments of knowledge they no longer fully understood? What if Sumer wasn't humanity's first complex civilization, but its first attempt at reconstruction? The mythological evidence suggested exactly this scenario. The gods' regret after the flood, their promise never to destroy the world completely again, their decision to use more selective pressures in the future, these weren't abstract theological concepts. They were policy adjustments, learned responses to the recognition that total erasure was counterproductive. Even the mythological minds behind the flood had realized that complete destruction led to unacceptable knowledge loss, which meant they had experience with the consequences of civilizational collapse. They had tried total reset before and discovered it was too destructive to repeat. But who were they? The myths described gods making these decisions. But if the gods represented encoded memories of human knowledge systems, then they might have been the survivors of an even earlier collapse, teachers and knowledge keepers who understood the fragility of complex societies and the necessity of preserving critical information through catastrophic transitions. The flood myths might be describing not one collapse, but a recurring pattern of civilizational rise and fall, with each cycle preserving fragments of knowledge from the previous iteration while losing other crucial elements to the chaos of reconstruction. And if that was true, then the flood story wasn't just ancient history. It was instruction about the present. Because modern civilization faced the same vulnerabilities that had destroyed its predecessors. Dependence on complex systems that most people didn't understand. Concentration of knowledge in institutions that could be disrupted. Reliance on technologies that required specialized expertise to maintain. If the flood came again, whether as a natural disaster, social collapse, or technological failure, how much of what we considered essential knowledge would survive? How many of our own survivors would be capable of rebuilding the systems we took for granted? And how much of what we called progress might actually be reconstruction, guided by half-remembered instructions encoded in stories we've learned to interpret as primitive mythology rather than practical warning? Brennan closed his research files and sat in the deepening darkness of his office, listening to the quiet hum of climate control systems, maintaining optimal conditions for the preservation of ancient texts. Outside, Cambridge hummed with the confident energy of modern academic civilization, secure in its assumption that knowledge once gained could never truly be lost. But the flood myths whispered otherwise. They preserved the memory of a time when advanced knowledge had been lost, when complex systems had collapsed, and when human civilization had been forced to start over from fragments, hoping they contained enough information to rebuild something recognizable. And they all ended the same way, with a promise that it wouldn't happen again, coupled with the quiet understanding that promises made by human institutions were as durable as the civilizations that made them. This left one final question echoing through the mythological silence. If every culture remembered the flood, who among us was prepared for the next one? And what knowledge were we preserving in forms that could survive the forgetting that comes when the waters of chaos rise again? Chapter 9. The Sky Map That Shouldn't Exist. Dr. Morrison had handled thousands of cylinder seals during her 23-year career as a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but she had never encountered one that made her question the fundamental assumptions of ancient astronomy until she was asked to authenticate VA 243. The seal itself was unremarkable. A small limestone cylinder, roughly the size of a pencil eraser, carved sometime between 2500 and 200 BCE. Mesopotamian artisans had produced tens of thousands of such seals, used to roll identifying marks into wet clay for legal and administrative purposes. Most depicted conventional scenes: gods receiving offerings, kings hunting lions, scribes recording transactions. But when Morrison examined VA 243 under magnification, she found herself staring at something that shouldn't exist in the archaeological record of the ancient Near East. At the center of the carved scene was a radiant star with clearly defined rays, unmistakably representing the sun. This alone was unusual. Most Mesopotamian art personified celestial bodies as human figures rather than depicting them as astronomical objects. But surrounding the central sun were 11 distinct spherical bodies arranged in what could only be described as orbital positions. It looked exactly like a diagram of the solar system, the same solar system that wouldn't be accurately mapped until Copernicus proposed heliocentrism in 1543, nearly 4,000 years after the seal was carved. Morrison sat down her magnifying glass and walked to her office window, staring out at Central Park while her mind processed the implications. According to everything archaeology knew about ancient astronomy, the Sumerians should have been geocentrists, believing Earth was the center of a universe where the sun, moon, and visible planets orbited around a flat Earth. They should never have depicted the sun as the center of anything. And they certainly shouldn't have shown 11 orbiting bodies when only 5 planets were visible to naked eye observation. Yet there it was, pressed into limestone by an anonymous artisan who had somehow created an accurate representation of solar system structure 3 millennia before telescopes were invented. The conventional academic response was dismissal. Morrison had read the papers. VA 243 was symbolic, not astronomical. The central star represented divine authority. The surrounding spheres were decorative elements, perhaps representing the 11 servants mentioned in certain mythological texts. Any resemblance to actual planetary arrangement was coincidental, but coincidences in archaeology made Morrison uncomfortable, especially when they challenged established timelines of human knowledge. She returned to her desk and pulled up the digital archive containing high-resolution images of the seal. Under careful examination, the details became more troubling. The 11 spheres weren't identical or randomly placed. They varied in size in ways that corresponded roughly to the relative sizes of planets as seen from Earth. One sphere was notably larger, possibly Jupiter. Another was tiny, perhaps Mercury. A few appeared clustered together as if representing the inner planets. If this was decorative symbolism, it was remarkably sophisticated decorative symbolism that happened to match astronomical reality with uncanny precision. Morrison opened her files on Mesopotamian astronomy and found the same pattern she had encountered throughout Sumerian artifacts. Knowledge that appeared to exceed the tools available to acquire it. Astronomical observations accurate to fractions of degrees. Mathematical calculations that anticipated discoveries made centuries later. Engineering specifications that demonstrated an understanding of physical principles supposedly unknown to ancient civilizations. And now, apparently, a heliocentric diagram created when the rest of the world believed Earth was flat and stationary. The academic community had developed elaborate explanations for dismissing such anomalies. Zecharia Sitchin's interpretations of VA 243 as evidence of ancient astronaut contact had been thoroughly debunked by legitimate scholars, and rightly so. Sitchin's translations were often inaccurate, and his conclusions were frequently unsupported by evidence. But discrediting Sitchin's theories didn't explain away the artifact itself. Morrison found herself thinking about double standards in archaeological interpretation. If a 17th-century European had carved the same image, historians would cite it as evidence of early astronomical knowledge. If a 19th-century scientist had sketched the same diagram, it would be considered a valuable record of telescopic observation. Only because VA 243 was ancient did scholars feel comfortable dismissing it as coincidental symbolism, which raised an uncomfortable question. How much ancient evidence was being ignored because it didn't fit established theories about the development of human knowledge? The seal's function troubled her almost as much as its imagery. Cylinder seals weren't decorative art. They were identity markers pressed into clay to authorize documents and establish ownership. They represented the most important symbols their owners could imagine, the images they wanted associated with their names and authority. Why would a Mesopotamian official choose to mark his signature with what appeared to be a diagram of the solar system unless it meant something more than decoration? Unless it represented inherited knowledge, a cosmological understanding passed down through generations, even after its original context had been forgotten? Morrison pulled up her research on the broader context of Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge. The evidence was undeniable. Sumerian and Babylonian astronomers demonstrated understanding of planetary motion, eclipse prediction, and celestial mechanics that seemed to exceed what should have been possible with naked eye observation alone. They tracked Venus through its complete 584-day cycle with mathematical precision. They predicted lunar eclipses months in advance. They understood that planets followed different paths across the sky than stars, and they developed mathematical models to predict these movements. Most troubling, they described celestial phenomena that were barely visible without telescopic aid. Saturn's rings, which appeared as handles or arms in ancient texts. Jupiter's moons, described as family members accompanying the planet. Planetary color variations that were difficult to detect without magnification. How had they acquired such detailed astronomical knowledge using only naked eye observation? The mythological explanations provided clues that mainstream archaeology preferred to ignore. Sumerian creation myths consistently described the Anunnaki as teachers who came down from heaven to instruct humanity in the sciences, including astronomy and mathematics. These myths contain detailed descriptions of cosmic structure, planetary relationships, and celestial mechanics. Most scholars interpreted these myths as symbolic explanations for natural phenomena. But what if they were something else entirely? What if they preserved cultural memory of actual instruction, not from gods, but from teachers whose astronomical knowledge exceeded what their students could fully comprehend or maintain? Morrison found herself staring again at the high-resolution image of VA 243, noting details that became more unsettling the longer she examined them. The proportions were too accurate to be accidental. The arrangement was too systematic to be decorative. The astronomical correspondence was too precise to be coincidental. Someone had carved this seal with knowledge of solar system structure that wouldn't be rediscovered for millennia. In the growing silence of her office, Morrison confronted a possibility that challenged everything she thought she knew about the development of human astronomy. What if advanced astronomical knowledge had existed in the ancient world, preserved in symbolic form by cultures that no longer fully understood what they were preserving? What if artifacts like VA 243 weren't primitive attempts to represent the cosmos, but sophisticated preservation systems designed to maintain astronomical knowledge across potential periods of civilizational collapse? And if that was true, how much other ancient evidence might be waiting in museum collections around the world? Artifacts dismissed as decorative or symbolic that actually contained encoded scientific knowledge from traditions we had learned to classify as primitive mythology. The implications were staggering. Every cylinder seal, every carved relief, every piece of ancient astronomical art might need to be re-examined with the possibility that its creators possessed knowledge we had assumed was beyond their capabilities. Because if VA-243 really was a map of the solar system, then someone in the ancient world had understood cosmic structure with an accuracy that wouldn't be matched until the scientific revolution. Someone had known that Earth orbited the Sun, the planets followed predictable paths, and that the solar system contained bodies invisible to naked eye observation. Someone whose identity had been lost to time, but whose knowledge had been preserved in symbols pressed into stone and clay, waiting for minds sophisticated enough to recognize instruction disguised as art. And why does that possibility, that we might be surrounded by encoded astronomical knowledge we lack the insight to interpret, feel less like discovery and more like recovery of understanding we once possessed but somehow learned to forget? The hill had been hiding in plain sight for 11,000 years. Chapter 10. The Memory Hidden in Stone. Dr. Klaus Schmidt first encountered it in 1994, while traveling through the arid landscape of southeastern Turkey on his way to survey other archaeological sites. Local shepherds had always been aware of the strange stones that occasionally appeared on the hilltop, but no one had ever thought to investigate what lay beneath the centuries of accumulated soil and debris until Schmidt began to dig. What he uncovered completely transformed what archaeology thought it knew about human civilization. Beneath that seemingly ordinary hill rested Göbekli Tepe, a complex of massive stone circles constructed around 9600 BCE, predating Stonehenge, the pyramids, the earliest cities of Mesopotamia, older, in fact, than agriculture itself. This posed a problem that archaeologists were still grappling with. How do you construct monumental architecture before the advent of farming? How do you organize large-scale construction projects before cities have been developed? How do you create sophisticated symbolic art before writing has been invented? Standing amidst the T-shaped pillars on a cool morning in 2019, 25 years after the first excavation, Schmidt felt the weight of the questions that had shaped his career. The megalithic structures surrounding him shouldn't exist according to every model of human development. They represented a level of social organization, artistic sophistication, and engineering capability that was supposed to emerge gradually from simpler foundations. But Göbekli Tepe had no simpler foundations. It appeared fully realized in the archaeological record, like a monument built by people who already knew exactly what they wanted to construct. The pillars themselves were masterpieces of Neolithic engineering. Each T-shaped monolith stood as tall as 18 feet and weighed up to 20 tons. They were quarried from bedrock using stone tools, transported across rough terrain without wheels or domesticated animals, and erected with precision that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of structural engineering and load distribution. And they were adorned with carvings that suggested remarkable complexity in symbolic thinking. Schmidt traced his fingers along the relief sculptures that decorated the nearest pillar. Foxes, vultures, snakes, wild boars, oryx, and abstract symbols arranged in systematic patterns. The imagery was not random. It seemed to encode meaning according to rules that archaeologists were still attempting to decipher. The most disturbing carvings were humanoid figures, stylized beings with folded arms, belt decorations, and what seemed to be ritual regalia. They were carved with anatomical precision, suggesting the artists were working from direct observation rather than abstract symbolism, but observation of what or whom. The astronomical alignments troubled Schmidt almost as much as the symbolic complexity. Several of the stone circles were oriented to track the rising of Sirius, while others seemed designed to mark solstices and equinoxes. This suggested that the builders had systematic knowledge of celestial mechanics at a time when humans should have been entirely focused on survival. How had hunter-gatherers developed sophisticated astronomy? And why had they considered it crucial enough to encode in monumental architecture? The more Schmidt studied Göbekli Tepe, the more convinced he became that he wasn't looking at humanity's first attempt at monumental construction. The level of planning, execution sophistication, and symbolic consistency all suggested that the builders were following established traditions rather than inventing new techniques. But traditions inherited from whom? And preserved for what reason? The site's expansion patterns provided clues that deepen the mystery. Göbekli Tepe hadn't been built all at once. Multiple stone circles were constructed over several centuries, each showing refinements in technique and developments in symbolic content. The builders had clearly worked according to a master plan that evolved over generations. Yet there were no permanent settlements, no evidence of domestic architecture, no signs of agricultural infrastructure that should have been necessary to support such large construction projects. It was as though they had appeared, built this monumental complex, and then vanished, leaving only stones and silence behind. The intentional burial was what led Schmidt to believe something extraordinary had occurred at Göbekli Tepe. Around 8000 BCE, the builders had carefully covered the entire site with tons of stone and debris, preserving it instead of destroying it. This wasn't abandonment, it was deliberate concealment. Someone had wanted to ensure that Göbekli Tepe would survive, even if the knowledge of its creators did not. Standing in the shadow of the pillars, Schmidt thought about preservation and forgetting. The careful burial suggested that the builders understood the fragility of human memory and the tendency of civilizations to lose track of their origins and purposes. They had built Göbekli Tepe not just as a monument but as a message. And when they could no longer actively maintain the message, they had hidden it in stone and earth, hoping that future generations might eventually develop the ability to uncover and interpret what they had preserved. But preserved from what? And for whom? The implications reached far beyond archaeology. If Göbekli Tepe represented the work of a sophisticated pre-agricultural civilization, then everything about the development of human society needed to be reconsidered. The standard narrative that complex culture emerged gradually from simple hunter-gatherer bands through agriculture and permanent settlements was contradicted by the existence of monumental architecture that predated farming by several millennia. This raised the possibility that human civilization was far older than anyone had imagined, with roots reaching into prehistoric periods that had left few traces in the archaeological record. Schmidt walked among the stone circles, noting details that grew more unsettling the longer he studied them. The symbolic consistency across different phases of construction suggested cultural continuity over centuries. The astronomical alignments indicated systematic observation of celestial phenomena. The artistic sophistication revealed minds capable of abstract thinking and symbolic representation. All of it pointed to the existence of a coherent cultural tradition that had somehow vanished from the historical record, leaving only this monumental site as evidence of its existence. But if one such civilization had existed and been forgotten, how many others might have risen and fallen without leaving traces? How much human history might be missing from the archaeological record because it had been deliberately hidden, accidentally lost, or systematically erased? The silence after Göbekli Tepe's burial was complete. For 8,000 years, the site lay hidden while other civilizations rose and fell across the Middle East. The Sumerians built their cities and ziggurats. The Egyptians raised their pyramids. The Greeks developed philosophy and democracy. The Romans conquered the Mediterranean, all of them unaware that beneath a hill in Turkey lay evidence of architectural and symbolic sophistication that predated their achievements by millennia. Which made Schmidt wonder, what if Sumerian civilization, with its sudden appearance of advanced knowledge and complex systems, wasn't humanity's first attempt at organized society? What if it was humanity's first successful attempt at preserving and rebuilding what had been lost when earlier civilizations disappeared? The patterns were eerily similar. Both cultures appeared with remarkable sophistication already intact. Both demonstrated knowledge that seemed to exceed their supposed developmental stage. Both showed obsessive concern with preservation and memory, as if they were working to maintain something that could not be allowed to disappear again. In the growing twilight, Schmidt stood among the ancient pillars and felt the weight of 11,000 years of silence. The stones around him were older than written history, older than the earliest cities, older than the agricultural revolution that was supposed to have made civilization possible. They were monuments to a way of thinking and building that had somehow developed among human beings who were supposed to be living in small, scattered groups focused entirely on survival. But the evidence was undeniable. Here, carved in stone and buried with care, was proof that human capability and cultural sophistication extended much further back in time than anyone had imagined. And if that was true, then everything about the origins of knowledge, the development of civilization, and the relationship between past and present needed to be reconsidered. Because Göbekli Tepe whispered the same message that echoed through Sumerian achievements, that human civilization might not represent a gradual ascent from primitiveness, but a process of recovery from sophisticated origins that had been almost but not entirely forgotten. And why does that possibility, that we might be remembering rather than discovering, recovering rather than inventing, feel less like revelation and more like recognition of something we had always suspected but never dared to acknowledge? Chapter 11. The Libraries That Were Burned. Dr. Irving Finkel had worked late many times during his 40-year career as a curator of ancient collections, but tonight felt different. Spread across his desk were photographs of tablet fragments from the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal. Pieces of the most comprehensive ancient archive ever discovered, now scattered across museums worldwide, like the remnants of a literary disaster. Each fragment represented knowledge that had nearly vanished forever, and most of their sister tablets hadn't been as fortunate. Finkel picked up a photograph of tablet K2669, a mathematical text containing astronomical calculations of extraordinary sophistication. The tablet had survived 26 centuries only because of an accident of destruction. When Nineveh burned in 612 BCE, the flames that consumed the library had baked the clay tablets instead of destroying them, preserving them like pottery fired in a kiln. Without that catastrophic fire, we would never have known the Epic of Gilgamesh existed. We would never have discovered the mathematical tables that revealed Babylonian understanding of advanced astronomy. We would never have found the medical texts that demonstrated surgical knowledge not matched elsewhere for centuries. The thought that filled Finkel with quiet rage was simple. If the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal had survived by accident, how much knowledge had been lost when similar libraries burned without the same fortuitous preservation? The answer was visible in every excavation report he had studied. Across Mesopotamia, archaeologists had found the remains of tablet collections that had been deliberately destroyed, accidentally lost, or simply abandoned to the elements. At Uruk, the city where writing was invented, entire archive buildings had been reduced to scattered fragments. At Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, administrative libraries had been pillaged and scattered. At Eridu, the city Sumerians claimed was the first ever built, knowledge collections had vanished so completely that their existence could only be inferred from empty storage rooms and broken shelving. The scale of the loss was staggering. For every tablet that survived in museum collections, dozens had been destroyed, dissolved, or crumbled into unreadable dust. For every text that had been translated, hundreds of others existed only as fragments too small to interpret. Finkel stood and walked to the climate-controlled vault, where the museum's most fragile clay tablets were stored, row upon row of carefully catalogued fragments, each one a miracle of survival. Each one represented knowledge that had almost been lost forever, but also each one a reminder of what hadn't survived. The destruction hadn't been accidental. As Finkel had learned through decades of research, the loss of ancient knowledge followed predictable patterns. When empires fell, new rulers systematically destroyed the archives of their predecessors. When religions changed, theological libraries were burned as heretical. When languages shifted, old scripts became unreadable, and their tablets were discarded as worthless clay. Knowledge wasn't just forgotten, it was actively erased. The process had continued through history with depressing consistency. The Library of Alexandria was repeatedly damaged by political upheaval and religious conflict. Mayan codices were systematically burned by Spanish conquistadors who considered them demonic. Buddhist manuscripts were destroyed during Chinese imperial purges. Islamic texts were lost during Mongol invasions. Each destruction represented the same fundamental dynamic. The past became dangerous to the present, so the present eliminated the past. But the loss was more subtle than dramatic acts of destruction. Much ancient knowledge disappeared through simple neglect. Scribes stopped copying texts that seemed irrelevant to contemporary needs. Libraries stopped maintaining collections that no longer served political or religious purposes. Archives were abandoned when the institutions that created them lost power or influence. The result was a kind of cultural Darwinism, where only knowledge that served immediate needs survived, while deeper understanding was gradually filtered out of the historical record. Finkel returned to his desk and opened a file containing his analysis of missing Sumerian literature. Based on references in surviving texts, scholars could reconstruct the titles and approximate contents of hundreds of lost works. Astronomical treatises, mathematical commentaries, mythological cycles, historical chronicles, technical manuals. The Sumerians had apparently written comprehensive guides to metallurgy, agriculture, medicine, law, and engineering. They had composed epic poems that made the surviving literature look like fragments of larger cycles. They had created mathematical works that pushed the boundaries of theoretical understanding. All of it gone, leaving behind only tantalizingly brief references in the few texts that happened to survive. What haunted Finkel most was the realization that much of what modern archaeology considered mysterious about Sumerian civilization might not have been mysterious at all. The sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge, the advanced understanding of astronomy and mathematics, the complex organizational systems, all of it might have been clearly explained in texts that were lost when their libraries burned. We called Sumerian achievements mysterious because we were missing the instruction manuals. The pattern repeated throughout ancient history. Every civilization that demonstrated advanced capabilities also left evidence of extensive literary and scientific collections that didn't survive. The mystery of their achievements was often simply the mystery of their missing libraries. In the growing darkness of his office, Finkel found himself thinking about preservation and forgetting as active processes rather than passive accidents. Someone had decided what deserved to survive and what could be allowed to disappear. Someone had chosen which texts to copy and which to abandon. Someone had determined which knowledge served the interests of power and which represented a threat to established order. The process was still happening. Modern libraries discarded books that seemed outdated. Digital archives deleted files to save storage space. Institutional memory disappeared when organizations restructured. Knowledge that didn't fit contemporary frameworks was quietly removed from circulation. The flood that had nearly destroyed human civilization hadn't been made of water. It had been made of fire and forgetting, conquest and censorship, neglect and deliberate erasure. And it was still rising. Finkel closed his research files and sat in the silence of the archive, surrounded by thousands of clay tablets that had survived against impossible odds. Each one represented knowledge that someone had considered important enough to preserve in permanent form. Each one had been created by hands that understood the fragility of memory and the necessity of encoding crucial information in materials that could outlast biological recall. But they had also understood something else. That preservation required intention. Knowledge didn't survive automatically. It survived because people made deliberate choices to maintain it across generations. The Sumerians had tried to write down everything they considered important. They had created redundant copies. They had distributed their libraries across multiple cities. They had embedded crucial information in myths and rituals that could survive even if the written records were lost. They had understood that civilization was always one library fire away from amnesia. And they had been right. Most of what they had tried to preserve was gone, leaving behind only fragments that hinted at the scope of what had been lost. Their mathematical achievements survived in scattered tablets. Their astronomical knowledge existed in incomplete observations. Their mythological understanding was preserved in stories that had been copied and recopied until the original meanings were obscured. But enough had survived to reveal the outline of something extraordinary. A civilization that had achieved remarkable understanding of the natural world and had tried desperately to pass that understanding to future generations. They had failed mostly, but their failure had been partial rather than complete, leaving behind just enough evidence to suggest what we might have known if the libraries had survived. And why does that possibility, that we are living with the intellectual impoverishment that comes from systematic knowledge destruction, feel less like historical tragedy and more like ongoing catastrophe? As if the flames that consumed ancient libraries are still burning, still reducing human understanding to ash and dust, and the fading memory of wisdom we once possessed but learned to forget. Chapter 12. The Words That No One Agrees On. Professor Elena Kazakova stared at the same uniform sign on her computer screen until her eyes began to sting. After 15 years of teaching Sumerian language and literature at Columbia University, she thought she understood the limits of ancient translation. But sitting in her office at 2 o'clock in the morning, surrounded by competing interpretations of a single word, Kazakova experienced the familiar vertigo that came from realizing how much meaning could be lost in the gaps between languages. The word in question was Anunnaki, appearing in thousands of texts across millennia, but no two scholars agreed on its exact meaning. The traditional interpretation rendered it as gods or divine beings, a translation seen in most textbooks and museum displays, but the root etymology suggested something more specific. Anunnaki could be broken down as those of Anu who are upon the earth, or offspring of the sky god who came down, or even simply the princely seed. Each translation carried radically different implications regarding the nature of these beings and their relationship to humanity. Kazakova opened her research files and scrolled through the competing scholarly interpretations that had developed over the past century. Religious scholars favored metaphorical readings, emphasizing the Anunnaki's symbolic significance rather than their literal one. Mainstream archaeologists treated them as mythological personifications of natural forces. Alternative researchers argued for historical interpretations, suggesting they might have been actual beings who interacted with ancient humans. Same word, same tablets, completely different stories. The problem wasn't just limited to Anunnaki. Sumerian literature was filled with terms whose meanings shifted depending on the translator and their theoretical framework. The word me, traditionally rendered as divine decrees, could also be interpreted as cosmic laws, cultural programs, or even technological packages. The term Aden, typically translated as plain or steppe, carried linguistic connections to the Hebrew Eden, connections that some scholars embraced while others rejected. Each translation choice had cascading effects on the interpretation of Sumerian civilization, turning the same texts into evidence for completely different theories about ancient history. The fundamental challenge was that Sumerian was a dead language in the truest sense. It had no living descendants, no native speakers, and no oral traditions to clarify ambiguous passages. The pronunciation was largely guesswork based on later Akkadian borrowings. The grammar was reconstructed from limited examples, and the cultural context that would have made metaphors and idioms comprehensible had vanished along with the civilization that created it. Modern translators were essentially archaeologists of meaning, attempting to reconstruct not just words, but entire conceptual frameworks from fragmentary evidence. Kazakova pulled up her analysis of a particular tablet that had sparked decades of scholarly debate. The text described the Anunnaki descending from heaven to take counsel with humans about the governance of cities. Traditional interpretations rendered this as a mythological account of gods establishing divine kingship, but alternative readings suggested it might describe actual historical meetings between different groups of people, with heaven representing elevated social status rather than celestial origin. The difference wasn't academic. It represented fundamentally different understandings of whether Sumerian texts preserved mythological allegory or distorted historical memory, and there was no objective way to decide between them. The ambiguity was built into the nature of ancient writing itself. Sumerian scribes had written for audiences who shared their cultural assumptions, religious frameworks, and historical understanding. They hadn't needed to explain the basic premises of their worldview because everyone already knew them. But those shared assumptions had died with the civilization that held them, leaving behind texts that operated according to logic that modern readers could no longer fully access. Kazakova found herself thinking about the political dimensions of translation. Academic careers were built on particular interpretations of ancient texts. Research grants depended on proposals that promised to clarify historical questions. Museum exhibitions required definitive explanations that could be presented to public audiences. The pressure to choose definitive meanings for ambiguous words was enormous, even when the evidence didn't support certainty. The result was a kind of intellectual colonization of the past, where modern ideological frameworks were projected backward onto ancient texts that might have operated according to entirely different conceptual systems. Religious scholars found confirmation of spiritual truths. Rationalist archaeologists found evidence of mythological thinking. Alternative researchers found suggestions of suppressed historical realities. Everyone found what they were looking for because the gaps in understanding were large enough to accommodate almost any interpretation. The Anunnaki had become a perfect example of this phenomenon. In popular culture, they had been transformed into everything from benevolent space visitors to malevolent genetic manipulators, depending on which translation choices modern authors preferred. Academic scholars dismissed these interpretations as pseudoscience, but their own translations were often equally speculative, just expressed in more cautious language. The original meaning, whatever it had been, was lost somewhere between the ancient scribes who wrote the words and the modern translators who tried to decode them. In the growing silence of her office, Kazakova confronted the unsettling possibility that much of what scholarship claimed to know about Sumerian civilization was actually educated guesswork dressed up as authoritative knowledge. The confident assertions in textbooks and academic papers often rested on translation choices that were far more uncertain than their presentation suggested, which meant that the mystery of the Sumerians might not be a mystery of missing evidence, but a mystery of irretrievable meaning. The texts had survived, but the cultural context that would make them comprehensible had been lost as completely as if it had been deliberately erased. The words were still there, pressed into clay with the same care that had shaped them 4,000 years ago. But the intentions behind those words, the assumptions that had given them meaning, the shared understanding that had made communication possible. Everything had vanished, leaving behind symbols that could be read but not truly understood. Modern scholars were like visitors to a foreign country who had learned to pronounce the local words without understanding the culture that gave those words significance. They could read the signs, but they couldn't decode the meaning that the signs had carried for the people who created them. And perhaps that was the deepest loss of all. Not just the destruction of libraries or the forgetting of techniques, but the erosion of meaning itself, the slow dissolution of the conceptual frameworks that had made ancient knowledge comprehensible to ancient minds. The Anunnaki might have been gods, kings, teachers, visitors, symbols, or memories. The evidence could support any of these interpretations, and scholarly debate would likely continue for generations without resolution. Because the one thing that could settle the question, the living voice of someone who had been there, who had understood what the words meant when they were written, was the one thing that could never be recovered. Kazakova closed her research files and sat in the darkness of her office, listening to the quiet hum of the computer that held thousands of possible meanings for words that had once possessed single, definite significance. Outside, New York hummed with the confident noise of a civilization that believed it understood its own language, its own intentions, and its own relationship to truth. But how much of what seemed clear and definite today would become ambiguous and contested if future archaeologists tried to reconstruct its meaning from fragmentary evidence? How much certainty was actually interpretation, and how much interpretation was actually imagination filling the gaps where knowledge failed? And why does that possibility, that we might be living in our own age of mistranslation, reading signs we think we understand but whose true meaning has already begun to slip away, feel less like academic concern and more like an existential warning about the fragility of all human understanding? Chapter 13. The Academic Silence. Dr. Irving Finkel had worked in museums for 6 months when he made a discovery that would define his career. Not because of what he found, but because of what happened when he tried to talk about it. The tablet, catalogued under the identifier BM145793, was a Sumerian administrative text dated to around 2400 BCE. It had been sitting in storage since 1923, photographed but never fully translated, filed away in the vast institutional memory of one of the world's most comprehensive archaeological collections. Hassan was a junior research fellow tasked with the unglamorous work of creating digital catalogs for uncategorized artifacts. His job was to provide basic descriptions, not groundbreaking analysis. But when he began translating the ununiform signs on tablet BM145793, he found himself staring at something that challenged fundamental assumptions about ancient Mesopotamian astronomy. The tablet contained precise calculations for planetary orbital periods that shouldn't have been possible with Bronze Age observation techniques. Not approximations or rough estimates, but mathematical values that matched modern measurements to within decimal points. Hassan double-checked his translation, consulted with senior colleagues, and ran the calculations through contemporary astronomical software. The ancient values were correct in ways that seemed to require instrumentation far beyond anything the historical record suggested the Sumerians possessed. When he submitted his preliminary findings to his department supervisor, the response was swift and discouraging. Interesting, but probably not worth pursuing for publication. These kinds of anomalous readings usually turn out to have mundane explanations. Hassan never published his research. The tablet was refiled in storage, and 6 months later, his fellowship was not renewed. Sitting in his cramped office at a regional university 3 years later, Hassan had come to understand something about academic institutions that wasn't taught in graduate school. Silence was often policy disguised as methodology. The problem wasn't censorship in any dramatic sense. Nobody had forbidden him from studying anomalous tablets or pursuing unconventional interpretations. The restriction was subtler and more effective. Certain kinds of research simply weren't supported, funded, or rewarded within the existing institutional framework. Grants went to projects that promised to clarify established historical narratives, not challenge them. Publication opportunities existed for work that built incrementally on accepted theories, not research that suggested those theories might be fundamentally flawed. Academic positions were awarded to scholars who demonstrated expertise within recognized specializations, not those who crossed disciplinary boundaries or questioned basic assumptions. The result was a kind of intellectual ecosystem that selected against disruptive discoveries, ensuring that only research compatible with existing paradigms received the resources necessary for development and dissemination. Hassan opened his files on untranslated Sumerian texts and felt the familiar frustration that had driven him from prestigious institutions to academic obscurity. Conservative estimates suggested that less than 20% of recovered cuneiform tablets had been fully translated and published. The remainder sat in museum collections around the world, catalogued but unread, photographed but unstudied. Some contained routine administrative records, grain inventories, tax receipts, legal contracts, but others included references to unknown deities, unfamiliar astronomical observations, mathematical techniques that didn't match established understandings of ancient capabilities. These anomalous texts weren't hidden or classified. They were simply ignored, left in storage, while scholarly attention focused on materials that fit comfortably within accepted historical frameworks. Hassan had encountered dozens of such tablets during his brief tenure at major institutions, clay fragments that described engineering techniques supposedly unknown to ancient civilizations, astronomical observations that required precision instruments, mathematical calculations that anticipated discoveries attributed to much later periods. None of it was studied seriously because none of it was fundable, publishable, or career-enhancing within the current academic environment. The institutional pressures were understandable from a practical perspective. Universities operated on limited budgets and competitive markets. Scholars needed to produce publishable research to maintain employment. Departments required grant funding to justify their existence. Museums had to balance scholarly investigation with public programming and donor relations. Revolutionary discoveries were risky investments that might not pay off. Incremental research was safer, more reliable, more likely to produce measurable outcomes within acceptable timeframes. But the cumulative effect was the creation of knowledge gaps that couldn't be explained by missing evidence. Some questions remained unanswered, not because relevant information didn't exist, but because investigating those questions was institutionally discouraged. Hassan found himself thinking about the broader implications of academic gatekeeping. How much potentially transformative research was never conducted because it fell outside established funding priorities? How many anomalous artifacts were sitting in storage because they didn't fit comfortable interpretations? How many patterns were invisible because they required interdisciplinary approaches that didn't align with departmental structures? The answers were unknowable, which was exactly the problem. The things that weren't studied remained unstudied, creating blind spots in human knowledge that persisted, not because of evidential limitations, but because of institutional ones. The irony was profound. Modern scholarship had developed sophisticated techniques for recovering and interpreting ancient information. Archaeological methods could extract meaning from the smallest fragments. Linguistic analysis could decode dead languages with remarkable precision. Digital technology could preserve and cross-reference vast datasets with unprecedented efficiency. But all of these capabilities were constrained by human institutions that operated according to logic quite different from pure knowledge-seeking. Academic careers, funding priorities, publication pressures, and institutional politics shaped what questions were asked and what answers were permitted. The result was a kind of systematic forgetting that operated in real time. Not the accidental loss of information through fire or conquest, but the deliberate filtering of information through bureaucratic processes that determined what deserved attention and what could be safely ignored. Hassan closed his research files and walked to the small window of his office, looking out at the modest campus where he now taught introductory courses to undergraduates who would probably never hear about the anomalous tablets he'd discovered, the questions he'd wanted to pursue, or the institutional barriers that had prevented him from doing so. In the growing silence of the afternoon, he found himself wondering how many other researchers had encountered similar evidence and faced similar choices. How many had decided that career stability was more important than disruptive discovery? How many had learned to ask only the questions that academia was prepared to answer? The academic world prided itself on rational inquiry and evidence-based conclusions, but rationality operated within institutional contexts that were far from neutral. What counted as valid evidence, legitimate methodology, and acceptable interpretation was determined by human communities with their own interests, assumptions, and blind spots. Which meant that even in an age of unprecedented access to information, certain kinds of knowledge could become effectively invisible, not because they were false or unimportant, but because they were inconvenient to the institutional structures responsible for validating and disseminating human understanding. The silence wasn't the absence of evidence. It was the presence of choice, the collective decision to look in some directions and not others, to ask some questions and not others, to preserve some possibilities and quietly abandon others. And perhaps that was the most troubling realization of all. The forgetting that had erased so much ancient knowledge wasn't just a historical process that had ended with the development of modern scholarship. It was an ongoing dynamic that continued to shape what contemporary civilization chose to remember and what it chose to forget. Because in the end, the greatest threat to human knowledge might not be fire or conquest or natural disaster, but the simple bureaucratic decision to file certain questions under not worth pursuing and leave them there gathering dust in the archives of institutional indifference. And why does that possibility, that we might be living through our own age of systematic forgetting, losing understanding not through catastrophe but through administrative neglect, feel less like academic criticism and more like a civilizational warning about the fragility of curiosity itself? Chapter 14: The Civilization That Knew Too Much. Dr. Margaret Chen had been studying civilizational development for 28 years and believed she understood how human societies evolved. Small groups learned to farm, farming villages grew into towns, towns into cities. Cities then developed writing systems, legal codes, and religious institutions. It was a logical progression that explained the rise of every major civilization she had studied, except one. Standing in the reading room of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, surrounded by tablets, charts, and translation notes that represented decades of research into Sumerian civilization, Chun felt the weight of accumulated evidence that pointed toward a conclusion she couldn't quite bring herself to accept. The Sumerians hadn't followed the usual path. They didn't climb slowly from primitive beginnings to sophisticated achievement. Instead, they appeared in the historical record with capabilities that should have taken centuries to develop, knowledge that should have required generations to accumulate, and institutional systems that should have emerged gradually through trial and error. Instead, they arrived fully formed. Chun walked to the display case containing photographs of the earliest Sumerian tablets, dated around 3200 BCE. These weren't crude experiments in communication. They were polished documents written in standardized script, following established grammatical rules and recording complex transactions using sophisticated numerical systems. The earliest examples of human writing showed no learning curve. She moved to the astronomical charts that mapped Sumerian knowledge of planetary motion. The calculations were precise enough to predict eclipses, track Venus through its 8-year cycle, and create calendars that accounted for the complex relationship between lunar months and solar years. The earliest examples of human astronomy demonstrated accuracy that wouldn't be matched for millennia. The mathematical tablets told the same story. Sumerian numerologists had developed a base 60 system elegant enough to handle complex fractions, advanced enough to calculate square roots, and practical enough that modern civilization still uses it to measure time and space. The earliest examples of human mathematics contained techniques that modern students still struggle to master. Chun examined the pattern. The Sumerians hadn't gradually developed their capabilities. They had implemented them as if they were working from instructions rather than experimenting with possibilities. The urban planning was the most unsettling evidence. Ancient cities usually showed archaeological layers revealing gradual growth, small settlements expanding into larger ones, early buildings replaced by more sophisticated structures, infrastructure added piece by piece as populations grew and needs became more complex. But Sumerian cities followed a different pattern. They appeared to have been planned from the beginning with sophisticated drainage systems, organized districts, and monumental architecture that suggested their builders understood urban engineering principles from the moment construction began. Uruk hadn't grown into a city, it had been built as one. Chun returned to her desk and opened her comparative analysis of civilizational development timelines. Every other ancient society showed clear developmental phases. Egypt's pre-dynastic period preceded the unified kingdom by centuries. China's Neolithic cultures gradually evolved into historical dynasties. Mesopotamian societies before Sumer demonstrated slow progression from scattered villages to larger settlements. Only Sumer broke the pattern, appearing suddenly with capabilities that exceeded those of civilizations that supposedly learned from Sumerian examples. The technological sophistication was undeniable. Sumerian metallurgists developed smelting techniques and alloy recipes that required an understanding of chemistry and physics. Their medical practitioners created surgical procedures and pharmaceutical preparations that demonstrated systematic knowledge of human anatomy. Their engineers built irrigation systems and architectural monuments requiring mathematical precision and structural understanding. All of it emerged simultaneously, as if someone had activated multiple knowledge systems at once rather than developing them sequentially through gradual innovation. But perhaps the most telling evidence was what hadn't survived in the archaeological record. Every other ancient civilization left traces of its developmental phase. Crude early tools that evolved into sophisticated instruments, simple buildings that grew into complex architecture, basic art that developed into refined expression. The Sumerians left no such traces. Their earliest artifacts were already sophisticated. Their first buildings were already engineered. Their initial art was already symbolic and complex. It was as if they had skipped the learning phase entirely. Chun found herself thinking about the implications of what she was seeing. If Sumerian civilization hadn't developed gradually, then either the Sumerians were unprecedented geniuses who had somehow invented complex society from scratch, or they had inherited their knowledge from sources that were no longer visible in the archaeological record. The first possibility seemed to violate everything known about human cognitive development and social evolution. The second possibility suggested that much of what archaeology assumed about the origins of civilization was wrong. But there was a third possibility that Chun found even more unsettling, that Sumerian civilization represented not innovation, but recovery. That their remarkable capabilities weren't the result of sudden inspiration but the systematic preservation of knowledge that had been developed elsewhere earlier by minds whose identity had been lost to time. The mythological evidence supported this interpretation. Sumerian creation stories consistently describe civilization as something delivered rather than discovered. The Anunnaki were portrayed as teachers who provided pre-existing knowledge rather than gods who inspired human innovation. The Mi were described as cosmic principles that were recovered rather than invented. If these myths preserved cultural memory rather than pure fantasy, they suggested that Sumerian civilization had been designed to maintain knowledge systems that predated its own existence. Chun walked to the window and stared out at the Chicago skyline, thinking about the broader implications of what Sumerian evidence suggested about human history. If one ancient civilization had achieved remarkable sophistication and then disappeared so completely that only fragmentary knowledge survived in later reconstructions, how many others might have followed the same pattern? How much human history might be missing from the archaeological record because it had been systematically erased, accidentally lost, or deliberately hidden? The silence in the archive felt different now, pregnant with the weight of questions that challenged fundamental assumptions about human development. If Sumer represented recovery rather than innovation, then the entire timeline of civilizational progress needed to be reconsidered, which meant that modern civilization might not represent the pinnacle of human achievement but simply the latest attempt to recover capabilities that had been lost and regained multiple times throughout history. The thought was both humbling and terrifying. Humbling because it suggested that human potential was far greater than contemporary achievements indicated. Terrifying because it implied that even remarkable civilizations could disappear so completely that later societies would have no memory of their existence. And if that was true, then the most important question wasn't how the Sumerians achieved so much so quickly, but how much knowledge modern civilization might be forgetting while congratulating itself on its unprecedented sophistication. Chun closed her research files and sat in the growing darkness of the reading room, surrounded by evidence of human capabilities that exceeded what should have been possible for their historical context. Around her, thousands of tablets preserved fragments of knowledge systems that had somehow appeared fully formed in the archaeological record, flourished for centuries, and then gradually faded as later civilizations lost the ability to maintain what they had inherited. It was a pattern that felt less like ancient history and more like a contemporary warning. Because if the Sumerians had been rebuilding from incomplete memories of something even greater that had been lost, we had to ask, what were we rebuilding from? And what were we losing while we focused on what we thought we were discovering? The clay tablets sit in climate-controlled silence, waiting in museums across the world, in private collections, in storage rooms that haven't been opened in decades. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. Each one pressed with symbols that once carried meaning across the ancient world. Each one a fragment of something larger that we've learned to call mythology instead of memory. But what if we've been reading the story backward? What if civilization isn't a mountain we're climbing, but a circle we keep entering? What if progress isn't linear ascent, but cyclical recovery? What if every time we think we're discovering something new, we're actually remembering something old? The Sumerians appeared in history like a door opening in a wall we didn't know was there. Cities without prehistory. Writing without evolution, mathematics without learning curves. Knowledge systems so sophisticated they governed our world 5,000 years later, yet so mysterious we couldn't explain where they came from. They called their teachers the Anunnaki, those who came down from heaven. We call that mythology. But maybe mythology is just history that survived the flood, encoded in stories because stone tablets couldn't preserve what really mattered. The understanding that knowledge itself is fragile, that civilizations rise and fall, that memory can be deliberately erased. And maybe that's what the Sumerians really left us. Not just the first writing, the first cities, the first laws, but the first warning encoded in every myth about floods that washed the world clean. Hidden in every temple built to preserve what couldn't be allowed to disappear, whispered in every story about gods who once taught humanity and then left. Because if you wanted to hide the most important truth in human history, where would you put it? In a library that could burn, in a language that could die, in institutions that could fall? Or would you embed it so deeply in the foundations of civilization itself that even when everything else collapsed, even when the libraries burned and the languages died and the institutions crumbled, the truth would still be there, waiting in the shadows of every story we tell ourselves about where we came from? The Sumerians knew something we've forgotten. That forgetting isn't accidental. It's systematic. It's the natural consequence of believing that what we have can never be lost. That what we know can never be forgotten. That what we've built can never fall. But everything falls. Everything burns. Everything floods except the stories we tell in the dark when we think no one is listening. And maybe that's where the real truth is hiding. Not in the tablets we've translated, but in the silence between the words. Not in the myths we've decoded, but in the memory they're still trying to preserve. Because somewhere in that silence, something is waiting to be remembered. Something that knows we've been here before. Something that's watching us forget.